Threat inside. 3 tales of broken sanity. There is a specific comforting lie that we all tell ourselves when we finally lock our front doors at night. We listen to the heavy metallic click of the deadbolt sliding into place, we draw the heavy curtains closed, and we convince ourselves that the 4 walls of our home are an impenetrable fortress. We believe that whatever darkness is roaming the streets of the city is locked firmly on the outside. But what happens when you slowly realize that the lock on your front door isn't keeping the danger out? What happens when you realize it is only trapping you inside with it? Tonight, we are going deep into 3 heavily documented, terrifying accounts of people who discovered that their absolute worst nightmares were not waiting for them in a dark alleyway. They were waiting for them in their own driveways. They were standing directly outside their bedroom windows. And in one horrifying case, they were already living comfortably inside their own walls. Turn off your lights, check your locks, and whatever you do not look into the mirror. The first account takes place in a quiet, affluent, newly developed residential estate just off. It is a story about the terrifying realization that you never truly know the people sleeping just a few feet away from you. I have always considered myself to be a phenomenal judge of human character. The ability to read a room, to sense when something is fundamentally wrong about a person before they ever give you a tangible reason to feel that way. My neighbors fooled me completely. 3 years ago, my partner and I bought our very first home together. It was a modest, simple bungalow. Nothing spectacular, but it was ours, and the neighbors in the estate were wonderful. We painted the walls, we tended to the compound, and life was incredibly peaceful. Life was so good, in fact, that 18 months later, when the neighbors directly next door to us decided to sell their house, we jumped at the opportunity. Their property was significantly larger than ours. It had a long paved driveway, a secure garage, and luxury fixtures we had been dreaming of. We bought their larger house immediately and put our old, smaller house right next door up for sale the exact same week. After reading through several applications from potential buyers, we settled on a wealthy expatriate couple. They only spoke to us in English, never in the local pidgin or native dialects we were accustomed to, but they seemed perfectly pleasant. We had some warm small talk with them, gave them some maintenance tips about the property, and officially handed over the keys. Prowler was in their yard. The older solitary woman who lived in that house refused to open the gate. Instead, she screamed at my dad through the metal bars, aggressively threatening that if he didn't leave her property immediately, she would call the cops on him herself. The police eventually took a report, but since my dad hadn't gotten a clear, illuminated look at the man's facial features in the storm, there wasn't much they could legally do beyond increasing late-night patrols in our specific area. They highly recommended we install industrial security cameras, which my dad purchased the very next morning. In retrospect, my back neighbor's highly aggressive reaction still feels deeply, profoundly suspicious to me. Why was her very first instinct to violently threaten my panicked parents when all they did was knock to warn her of a trespasser? It raises horrifying questions in my mind that keep me awake at night. Was she secretly living with the massive man my dad saw? Or had she seen him lurking in her yard too, and genuinely thought it was the prowler pounding on her gate? Did I personally know the person who stood silently outside my bedroom window for years? Or was it just some creepy, predatory neighbor who happened to notice a teenage girl's room with poorly covered blinds and decided to take sick advantage of it? Did he only ever want to stand in the dark and watch? Or was he slowly, methodically working up the courage to do something infinitely worse? Even now, as an adult, those unanswered questions haunt my every waking moment. Knowing for an absolute fact that someone was really standing there the entire time makes every tiny scratching sound I brushed off, every ragged breath I thought I imagined in the wind, and every hulking silhouette I forcefully convinced myself not to look at, feel so much terrifying. I have since permanently switched bedrooms, and to this day, I absolutely cannot look at any ground floor window facing a dark backyard without feeling my chest tighten with panic. Thank God my new apartment window faces a busy, well-lit street. What scares me the absolute most about my childhood isn't just the fact that it happened. It is how many years it went on for without a single person believing me, and how easily, if that windstorm hadn't happened, it could have continued until he finally decided to open the glass. The final account is the stuff of absolute nightmares. It asks the horrific question, what if the entity you are trying to keep out of your house has actually been living comfortably inside it the entire time? It was a cold, incredibly damp evening in mid-December, and I was 15 years old. I originally lived in a cramped, densely packed apartment complex with my parents. However, we were severely running low on living space, and with my mother pregnant and my little sister on her way, we knew we had absolutely no choice but to upgrade and move to a bigger house. It seemed like a stroke of incredibly good luck for us at first, because my dad found a large, older house just a few blocks down the road that was selling for an unbelievably cheap price tag. Granted, it wasn't the most aesthetically pleasing building, and the surrounding area was a bit rough around the edges, but it had plenty of room for a growing family. And because the purchasing price was so drastically low, we had plenty of funds left over in the budget to renovate the interior to our heart's content. My dad is incredibly handy, so he immediately started renovating the lower ground floor, specifically the basement extension, as it was dark, damp, and almost entirely unusable without being stripped down and fixed up. He spent weeks down there, cleaning the concrete, laying down fresh carpeting, replacing the rotting wooden support beams, completely gutting and fixing the plumbing in the small bathroom. He even put up fresh, vibrant wallpaper with a cool geometric pattern that he let me specifically pick out myself. For the first couple of months, living in that spacious new house had been absolutely great. I loved my massive new room on the lower floor. Until the very first highly questionable, terrifying moment came along. It was a Friday night, my father's birthday, and to celebrate the occasion, we had all dressed up and gone out to a nice restaurant in the city for the evening. The dinner went perfectly. All was well, until we drove back into our driveway and found our heavy wooden front door standing completely wide open. My mom was absolutely shaken, her hands trembling. I was terrified, and we both begged my dad to put the truck in reverse and drive us far away from the property while she frantically dialed the police. But my dad is protective. He reached into the toolbox in the back of his truck, grabbed a massive, heavy steel wrench, and slowly walked through the open front door to physically search the dark house for the intruder himself. My mom and I locked the truck doors, called the cops anyway, and sat there in the dark for 5 excruciatingly long, agonizing minutes before the flashing lights finally arrived. The armed officers drew their weapons, entered the house, and eventually found my dad standing in the living room. My dad came back outside, wiping sweat from his forehead, and told us that, bizarrely, absolutely nothing of value was actually missing. The television, the jewelry, the electronics, everything was untouched, and there was definitively no one hiding inside the house. However, several of our personal items had been distinctly moved or violently knocked over. Specifically, the heavy stack of books on the bookshelf inside my lower floor bedroom had been completely shoved onto the floor. The police eventually finished their thorough room-by-room sweep, confirmed the house was clear, and told us the exact same thing. It was likely just a crime of opportunity by a local thug who got spooked and ran off. We were still incredibly paranoid, jumping at every shadow, but we eventually walked back inside and locked the door. From that specific day forward, I would constantly hear strange, distinct noises coming from deep inside the walls of my room, and sometimes echoing from underneath the foundation of the basement extension. I always rationalized it, quickly dismissing the heavy thuds and scraping sounds as just the old expanding water pipes. This was a very old house, after all. Settling noises were completely normal. That was until one night something utterly unexplainable and horrifying happened. It was around 2 o'clock in the dead of the morning. I was lying in my bed, completely hidden under the heavy sheets, playing my Nintendo DS with the volume completely muted so my parents upstairs wouldn't know I was still awake. The room was pitch black and dead silent. That is exactly when I heard it. Clear, distinct, raspy human laughter. And it was coming from directly inside the drywall, merely inches away from the side of my bed. My heart completely froze in time. I stopped breathing. My eyes probably widened to the size of dinner plates. I lay there paralyzed, my brain short-circuiting. I didn't know what I should do. Should I ignore it? Should I scream for my parents? Should I get out of bed and press my ear against the plaster to investigate? I decided to remain completely motionless and wait in the dark to see if the horrific sound happened again. But after about 30 agonizing minutes of laying there as still as a stone carving, the silence remained unbroken. I forcefully decided that it must have just been my exhausted, sleep-deprived imagination playing tricks on me, and I finally, restlessly forced myself to go to sleep. I woke up the next morning in my bed, and as usual, absolutely nothing in the room had changed. Despite the memory of that raspy laugh still burning a hole in my mind, I tried my absolute hardest to pass it off as a nightmare. I would still hear the same strange, heavy scraping noises echoing from the walls every so often over the next couple of weeks. But unfortunately, that deep sense of dread had just become my new normal. This is when the next major violent occurrence happened. By this time, my little sister had already been born, and since my lower floor room was by far the biggest in the house, and my mom deeply trusted me with keeping her safe, during the night they moved her crib downstairs and she began sharing the room with me. Now, this absolutely doesn't mean my mom didn't use electronic baby monitors, because she was incredibly protective and definitely did. She kept the main parent receiver unit upstairs in the living room and the backup receiver in the kitchen. One Friday night, my parents had dressed up and gone out for a much-needed late-night dinner date, leaving me completely in charge to take care of the house and the baby until they got back. I was sitting upstairs in the living room, comfortably watching a movie on the couch, when I got up to grab a quick snack from the kitchen. As I walked past the counter, I noticed odd, distinct noises transmitting through the speaker of the baby monitor. My heart instantly sank to the bottom of my stomach. I knew for an absolute, undeniable fact that no one else was home. My sister was incapable of walking. But those sounds coming through the static were footsteps. Loud, heavy-booted footsteps pacing across the carpet of my bedroom. Suddenly, my absolute worst, paralyzing fear was realized when my baby sister began frantically crying. And through the tiny speaker, cutting through her wails, I heard a deep, masculine voice let out a long, slow shush, followed immediately by a massive, violent physical crash in the room. I instantly acted on the very first primal instinct that came to my mind. An action which, thinking clearly in retrospect as an adult, could have very easily gotten both me and my sister brutally killed. I ran as quickly as my legs could carry me up the stairs to my parents' master bedroom, threw open the closet door, and grabbed my father's heavy hunting rifle. However, there was a major problem. I did not have the small metal key required to unlock the heavy trigger lock mechanism, nor did I have the time to search for any of the live ammunition. The gun was entirely, totally useless as a firearm. My desperate teenage brain figured I would just point the barrel, pretend it was fully loaded, and try my best to hide the metal trigger lock with the palm of my hand. If the intruder called my bluff and attacked me, I fully planned to use the heavy wooden buttstock of the rifle as a blunt club to defend myself. All I cared about in that singular moment was getting my baby sister to safety. When I reached the heavy door leading down to the lower floor, I twisted the knob quietly, opened it, and slowly walked down the wooden steps, raising the barrel of the rifle, turning instantly to face my sister's crib. The room was completely empty. No one was standing there, but my sister was still crying hysterically, and the plastic baby monitor camera had been violently knocked off the dresser and was now lying sideways on the carpet. I mustered every single ounce of terrifying courage I possessed in my body, aimed the empty rifle at the shadows, and yelled at the top of my lungs that I was armed and they needed to come out. Still, absolutely nothing. Total silence. I dropped the gun, grabbed my crying sister out of the crib, and sprinted blindly back up the stairs. I violently slammed the door shut behind me and shoved a heavy wooden dining chair under the metal handle to keep it securely barricaded while I pulled out my phone and frantically called my parents. They told me they were calling the police immediately, and they sped home as fast as their car could carry them. The police actually arrived at my house before my parents did. Because the house was considered an active, highly dangerous crime scene, the officers made me sit safely in the locked back seat of the cop car with my baby sister, while one of the armed officers drew his weapon and went inside to physically investigate the lower floor. When my parents finally pulled into the driveway, tires screeching, I cried and told them every single detail of what had just happened. They were deeply confused, but incredibly viscerally concerned. They knew my character. They knew I wasn't the type of kid that would ever lie or exaggerate about something this serious. The investigating police officer finally walked back out the front door, holstered his weapon, gave us the official all clear, and confidently stated that absolutely no one was hiding inside the house. Just as the officers finished taking our statements and were turning around to get back in their cruisers to leave, my dad stopped them. With a look of sudden horrific realization on his face, my dad worriedly asked the main officer if they had checked behind the bookshelf. In my lower floor room, there was a massive, heavy wooden bookshelf that came physically embedded into the drywall. It looked like a permanent, structural fixture of the architecture. So I was incredibly confused when my dad specifically asked the police to look behind it. The police officer was clearly confused too, and asked my father to step back inside with him to visually point out exactly what he meant. We all walked slowly back down the stairs into my room. Lo and behold, when we stepped onto the carpet, my massive, built-in bookshelf had been pushed outward, resting slightly open. It wasn't a structural fixture at all. It was mounted on heavy steel hinges, exactly like a hidden door. And the small, ground-level window on the far side of the room that leads up to the backyard was currently cranked opened all the way to the top. And my rolling desk chair had been deliberately planted directly under the sill, creating a perfect step stool. My dad grabbed the edge of the wooden bookshelf and pulled it wide open. Hidden directly behind the bookshelf was a small, narrow, secret utility room. It contained the main water pipes for our section of the house, and the thick metal pipes wrapped completely around the concrete walls. But that is not all that was in there. Scattered across the filthy concrete ground were piles of crinkled food wrappers, one of our favorite plastic kitchen cups that had mysteriously gone missing weeks prior, a stolen bottle of lotion, a heavy, sharpened steel switchblade, along with a red apple. It was partially eaten, and the exposed flesh of the fruit was still slightly fresh and wet. A grown man had been secretly, quietly living inside the walls of our house, and we didn't have a single clue this whole time. The police immediately deduced that most likely, while the officers were outside in the driveway talking to us and taking my statement, whoever was hiding in that secret room had quietly pushed the bookshelf open, used my desk chair to reach the window, and escaped into the dark backyard. The officers told us to call them immediately if we ever noticed anything remotely suspicious again. However, they confidently assured my terrified parents that they didn't think the intruder would ever risk coming back, now that his secret hiding spot had been completely discovered and compromised. But that discovery wasn't even the most deeply, psychologically horrifying part of the ordeal. A few days later, when the shock had slightly worn off, I walked back down to my room, pushed open the heavy wooden bookshelf myself, and thoroughly explored the tiny, claustrophobic room from top to bottom. That is exactly when I found a tiny, perfectly drilled hole in the plaster wall. I put my eye to it, and when I looked through the hole, the line of sight pointed directly, flawlessly at my mattress and my clothing dresser. Whoever the man was living in that dark, cramped space, he was spending his nights watching me sleep. He watched me get dressed. He watched me play my video games. He watched me do my homework at my desk. He listened to me speak on the phone to my friends. He watched absolutely everything. He knew the most intimate, private details of my entire life. I am an adult now, and I live far away in my own secure apartment with my boyfriend. But my aging parents still live in that exact same house. 5 years later, they refused to move. To this very day, I constantly worry for their safety, and I pray to God every single night that whoever the man in the walls was, he never, ever returns. 3 homes, 3 supposed sanctuaries, 3 terrifying realizations that the heavy locks on our doors are completely useless if the predator is already standing in the hallway. A couple who unknowingly sold their property to a violent criminal syndicate, turning their quiet street into a blood-soaked crime scene. A teenage girl who spent years being stalked through her own bedroom glass, while her family desperately tried to convince her she was just imagining the heavy breathing in the dark. A teenager who discovered a secret room behind a bookshelf and a drilled peephole aimed directly at the foot of his bed. In every single one of these accounts, the victims were looking nervously out into the dark streets, terrified of the outside world, completely unaware that the real danger had already crossed the threshold. When you go to sleep tonight, don't just lock your front door. Check your closets. Check the gaps in your blinds. And if you hear a strange, faint scratching sound coming from inside your drywall, pray that it is just the pipes. Looking back now, that brief, smiling conversation was the absolute calm before the storm. The severe disturbances started almost immediately. Even before the massive, violent incidents occurred, the entire atmosphere of the property felt deeply off. We started experiencing bizarre, aggressive disturbances at the strangest possible hours of the night. Sometimes, sitting in the dead of midnight, we would suddenly hear incredibly heavy, violent banging coming through the shared compound walls. Other times, incredibly loud, Deafening music would start blasting through the concrete without any warning whatsoever. It wasn't a constant occurrence, but it was frequent enough to make us feel like we did not truly know who was living just a few feet away from us. The very first massive red flag appeared when the husband came driving home one afternoon. His expensive luxury car had sustained severe, horrific damage to both sides of the vehicle. It looked exactly as if he had aggressively scraped against a steel guardrail at a very high speed on both the driver and passenger sides. When we walked over and asked him what on earth had happened, he gave us a highly clumsy, nervous excuse. He claimed he had scraped a heavy concrete pole on one side of the road, and then a large transport trailer had taken a turn way too wide and scraped the other side. We smiled and chose to believe him, because we wanted to be polite neighbors, even though the mathematical logic of that accident completely failed to add up. The evening that our lives descended into absolute chaos started with a panicked phone call. It was a suffocatingly humid evening, around 6 o'clock. The neighbor called my phone in a state of total, hyperventilating panic. He claimed that there were strange men standing outside his house right now, violently turning his exterior security cameras away from the building. He begged us to look out our window and call the police immediately. We rushed to the window and looked. Sure enough, there were two large, aggressive-looking men actively breaking into his front door. We dialed the authorities immediately. Because of the heavy Port Harcourt evening traffic, it took the police 20 minutes to arrive at the estate. By the time the sirens wailed down the street, the burglars were already completely gone. The neighbor's wife came racing into the street in her car, parked erratically, and frantically ran inside the house to check on her sweet little French bulldog and speak to the officers. That all seemed completely normal for a home invasion. But as I was walking my own dog outside, curiously watching the scene unfold, I saw something that made my blood run entirely cold. I watched the husband, the man who had called me in a panic, park his own car 3 entire streets away. I watched him slowly walk to the crime scene on foot. He was actively, deliberately hiding his vehicle from the police. Later that night, long after the police had left, we sat in our living room and reviewed our own doorbell camera footage from earlier in the afternoon. The high-definition video showed the main burglar standing completely calm on our front porch long before the break-in ever happened. He wasn't panicked. He was calmly speaking to someone just out of frame in a foreign European language, actively discussing which specific house on the street to target. Nothing had been stolen from the neighbor's house. No one had been caught. I told the investigating police officers the next day that it felt exactly like a stage setup, but I never heard back from them. Exactly 1 week later, I was attending a housewarming party across town when my phone vibrated. It was a text message from my partner. It read, "The music next door is insanely loud again." A few minutes later, my phone began to ring. I answered it, and my partner's tone had changed into pure, unadulterated terror. The neighbor's vehicle had just come tearing violently through our shared front garden at full speed, completely destroying the landscaping, and had slammed directly into the neighbor's own front door. 2 men were frantically, aggressively loading the back of the car with incredibly high-end electronics, massive flat-screen televisions, professional speakers, and other expensive gear. My partner said they looked exactly like the same 2 men from the stage break-in the week prior. This time, the police response was incredibly swift. They arrived at the estate in exactly 7 minutes. The armed officers intercepted the 2 men while they were still frantically trying to load the car. When the officers aggressively demanded their identification, the men claimed they didn't have any on them. And then, things got entirely surreal. The man sitting behind the steering wheel looked the police officer dead in the eye and confidently claimed to be my neighbor, using my neighbor's actual full legal name. But there was a massive, undeniable catch. In the 9 full months that they had lived next door to us, my actual neighbor had never spoken a single word of the local dialect or fluent English. This man in the car, however, spoke absolutely fluent English with a remarkably thick foreign accent. Realizing instantly that the game was up and the officers were drawing their weapons, the men slammed the car into gear. A violent, chaotic pursuit followed through the quiet, narrow streets of the estate, until the police finally managed to box their vehicle in and brutally arrest them both. But back at the house, my partner, still hiding inside, could hear distinct, heavy movement coming from deep inside our neighbor's property. The police were called back to the scene. They stormed the house and dragged out a third suspect who had been hiding in the dark. Later that evening, we were sitting inside our own living room with a police officer, filing a formal damage report for our destroyed front garden. Suddenly, our doorbell rang. We turned around and looked at the camera monitor. There he was, the actual neighbor. He was completely, utterly unrecognizable. His face was a swollen, horrific, bloody mess. One of his eyes was swollen entirely shut, black and purple. His mouth was violently torn at the edges, and his left arm hung by his side at a completely useless, sickening angle, covered in deep, bleeding wounds that looked exactly like defensive knife slashes. He looked entirely feral, aggressive, and completely broken. The police officer immediately stepped out onto the porch to intervene, but the neighbor flat out refused to file a police report. He refused medical attention. He refused to cooperate in any way, shape, or form. Since the bleeding victim absolutely refused to speak, the officer had no legal choice but to send the man back inside his own house. Later that exact same night, in the pitch black, the neighbor rang our bell again. He was trembling violently on our porch, crying. He looked me in the eyes and confessed that he had recently cheated on his wife. He claimed that she had found out about the affair, and she had hired those violent men to come to the house to take him out permanently. He fell to his knees and begged us to let him sleep on our floor. Terrified and wanting absolutely no part of this deadly underworld domestic drama, we firmly refused, but out of basic human pity, my partner offered to drive his bleeding body to the nearest hospital. We dropped him off at the emergency room at 10:30 at night, strictly telling him that we were going to stay at a hotel because we no longer felt safe at the estate. But we didn't stay elsewhere. We drove straight home, locked every single heavy door, bolted the windows, turned off all the interior lights, and sat in the dark, trying to breathe. At exactly 1 o'clock in the morning, our dog started growling. It wasn't a normal bark. It was a specific, deep, guttural, low growl that he only ever uses when a stranger is standing directly outside the door. We crawled on the floor, reached up, and checked the doorbell camera. There he was. The neighbor had returned from the hospital. He was standing on our dark porch, ringing the doorbell multiple times in rapid succession, his bloody face pressed against the lens. We sat completely frozen in the dark living room, watching the glowing screen in absolute terrified silence. We didn't make a sound. Then, after what felt like an absolute eternity, the bright headlights of a car turned onto our dark street. The neighbor panicked instantly. He scrambled frantically off our porch and ran directly toward our driveway. He threw his body down and hid behind our parked cars, crouching deep in the heavy shadows of the vehicles. Watching this bloodied, broken, hunted man lurking in the pitch black behind our own cars was one of the most deeply unsettling things I have ever witnessed in my life. The car slowly stopped in front of the houses. A woman got out. It was his wife. She walked slowly toward their front door, then she paused. She turned her head and slowly glanced over at our dark driveway. She saw him crouching in the shadows. My partner and I held our breath, our hearts hammering against our ribs, bracing ourselves for a violent confrontation or gunshots. She walked slowly toward the cars, and as she stepped into the pale, flickering yellow glow of the street lamp, she began to wail. It was a haunting, guttural, agonizing crying. He didn't say a single word. He just stayed crouched in the dirt. She kept frantically asking him questions in a foreign language, her sobbing getting louder and louder, echoing off the concrete walls of the empty street. Eventually, after 10 agonizing minutes, they both stood up, got into her car in complete silence, and drove away into the night. We didn't see a single trace of them for 3 entire days. We didn't even know if their little dog was still alive inside the house. The wife eventually returned to the estate completely alone. She found her dog starving inside the house. As she was packing a bag, she looked at us over the compound fence, her face completely hollow, and calmly told us that she doesn't think she will ever see her husband again. Whatever the real, terrifying truth of that story actually is, whether it was a drug cartel, massive underground debt, or a marriage that turned lethal, I realized one absolute truth that night. I don't think I ever want to know. This second account forces us to confront the sheer terror of our own vulnerability. We all want to believe that if someone was stalking us, our instincts would scream at us. But sometimes, our brains are so terrified of the truth that we convince ourselves we are just imagining things. This all started back in 2017, when my family moved into a quiet, older, split-level home in a peaceful, leafy suburb. Before I get into the deeply disturbing part of this story, I need to explain the specific architectural layout of my bedroom, because without it, the sheer horror of my point of view will not make sense. The house we moved into had staggered floor levels connected by very short flights of wooden stairs. My bedroom was completely unique. It was neither on the main upper floor with my parents, nor was it down in the basement. It sat exactly in between the two, perfectly at ground level. One solid wall of my room shared space with the dark, empty garage. The exact opposite side of the room featured a very large, wide window that looked directly out into the overgrown backyard. At the time we moved in, that window had cheap, plastic vertical blinds. Several of the plastic panels had snapped off and gone missing over the years. So, even when I pulled the blinds completely closed at night, I could still see outside into the dark yard through the 2-inch gaps. And on the garage side of my room was my large wardrobe closet, which featured massive sliding mirror doors that stretched from the floor to the ceiling. This specific geometry meant that when I was lying in my bed at night, no matter which side of the mattress I faced, I could always see my large, broken window perfectly reflected back at me in the mirrors. I started noticing the terrifying things about a year after we moved in, when I was 15 years old. I have always struggled with insomnia, so I had a bad habit of lying in the dark watching YouTube videos on my tablet, late into the night. One incredibly hot, humid night during the dry season, I heard something strange outside my window. I had left the glass slid completely open because the heat was suffocating, and my parents hadn't invested in a proper AC unit yet. I was entirely relying on whatever faint breeze I could catch. Suddenly, I heard what sounded exactly like heavy footsteps shuffling against the dry grass. I quickly tapped the screen, paused my video, and put the tablet face down on the mattress. The shuffling noise outside stopped at the exact same microsecond the video did. My anxious brain immediately jumped to the most comforting, logical conclusion. I convinced myself that the shuffling had just been audio from the video I was watching, or maybe just my paranoid imagination acting up. I picked the tablet up, hit resume, and started watching again. 10 seconds later, I heard it again. I slowly turned my head to the left, staring through the missing gaps in the plastic blinds, looking out into the pitch-black yard. I didn't see a single shadow moving. After 10 minutes of total silence, I eventually passed out and fell asleep. For a few nights, absolutely nothing happened. I forgot about it entirely. But then, a couple of nights later, during my usual late-night streaming routine in the dark, I heard the heavy, dragging shuffling again. I paused what I was watching, held my breath, and listened. This time, I waited much longer in the silence, and I swear to God, underneath the ambient sounds of the night, I could clearly hear deep, ragged human breathing coming from just inches outside the window screen. I glanced directly at the gaps in my window, but again, the darkness was absolute. I couldn't see a thing. I aggressively convinced myself that it was just the wind, or my own mind playing cruel tricks on me in the dark. Too terrified to keep looking at the glass, I rolled over on the mattress, turning my back to the window to face my mirrored closet doors instead. As I picked my glowing tablet back up to resume the video, my eyes drifted up to the reflection in the mirror, and I saw something physically move at my window through one of the missing gaps in the blinds. A violent, freezing chill ran straight down my spine. I didn't scream. I just silently got out of bed, crept out of my room, and sprinted up the short flight of stairs to wake my parents, deciding it was infinitely better to be safe than sorry. I shook my dad awake and frantically told him what I had seen and heard. Even though he clearly visibly doubted my story, he grabbed a heavy flashlight and went outside to check the dark backyard. A few agonizing minutes later, he came back inside, locking the door behind him. He told me he had checked every single dark corner of the compound and didn't see a thing. He logically pointed out that if someone had been sneaking around back there, he absolutely would have heard them open the incredibly heavy, squeaky metal gate on the side of the house. He even checked the security camera facing the driveway, which showed absolutely no one walking around the perimeter. I nervously suggested that the person could have easily scaled the concrete fence and jumped into the neighbor's yard. But my dad quickly shut that theory down, confidently stating that we lived in a highly secure, safe neighborhood, and aggressively told me I needed to stop watching creepy videos so late at night. Unfortunately for my own safety, I believed him. I went back to bed, pulled the covers over my head, and went to sleep. Every couple of weeks or months after that night, the exact same cycle would repeat. I would hear the distinct shuffling in the grass, I would hear the deep rhythmic breathing just outside the glass. And each and every single time, I forcefully convinced myself it was all inside my head. I tried to focus harder on my videos. I turned the volume up to drown out the night. When the rainy season arrived and the torrential downpours masked all the sounds of the neighborhood, the noises stopped entirely, and I eventually forgot about it. But the following year, when the dry season returned, it started again. It didn't happen every night, maybe once or twice a month at most, and always past 11 o'clock. I tried my absolute hardest not to pay attention to it, even when the noises outside my window sounded like clear, undeniable, heavy work boots snapping twigs or deep, ragged exhales. I consumed a lot of horror media, so I constantly gaslit myself, telling myself my brain was just seeking thrills in the dark. I entirely avoided looking at the window altogether. Even though I tried so desperately to believe it was all in my head, a deep, primal part of my subconscious was absolutely terrified of turning my head and being proven horrifyingly wrong. One night, against my better judgment, the scratching sounds were so loud I couldn't ignore them. I looked. I didn't look directly at the window. That was far too terrifying. I looked at the reflection in my closet mirror instead. And this time, illuminated by the ambient glow of the street lamp bleeding into the yard, I swear to God I saw the distinct, massive, hulking silhouette of a person standing completely still. I ran upstairs again, crying. And once again, after a brief, annoyed sweep of the backyard, my dad sat me down and told me the exact same logical excuses he had used the year prior. And once again, desperate to feel safe in my own home, I chose to believe him. This psychological torture went on for years. I altered my entire life around it. I started forcing myself to go to bed earlier, watching videos with heavy noise-canceling headphones, and completely obsessively avoiding looking at my mirror. And I absolutely never ever looked directly at the gaps in my blinds. It followed a strict, terrifying seasonal pattern. It always stopped when the heavy rains came, and it always returned in the mid-spring heat. One night in early December, a massive, violent windstorm hit our area. The wind was howling so loudly the roof was shaking. I was sitting in my room, streaming a game with my boyfriend over a voice call, when I decided to quickly run upstairs to grab a glass of water around 11:30 at night. As I reached the top of the stairs, I noticed my parents sitting completely still in the dark living room. It caught me totally off guard. They rarely ever stayed up that late, let alone sat in the dark outside their bedroom. Their faces looked incredibly tense, pale, and preoccupied. I nervously asked if everything was okay. They quickly brushed it off, waving their hands and assuring me it was absolutely nothing to worry about. I assumed I had simply interrupted a serious marital conversation not meant for my ears, so I grabbed my water and turned back toward the stairs. As my hand hit the railing, violent flashes of red and blue light suddenly flooded through the front living room window. A police cruiser was pulling directly into our driveway. My parents immediately stood up as if they had been anxiously waiting for the sirens. They rushed me straight down to my room, locking my door from the outside, hurriedly telling me they would come get me if they needed me. I sat on my bed in the dark, curiosity and dread completely eating away at my stomach. Not even 2 minutes later, my door unlocked, and I was called back upstairs. This time, they didn't keep me in the dark. My dad, his hands visibly shaking, sat me down at the kitchen table and explained the truth. He told me that about 20 minutes earlier, during the peak of the windstorm, he had grabbed a flashlight and stepped into the backyard to make sure no heavy tree branches had blown over onto the roof before he went to bed. While he was panning his flashlight across the howling, chaotic yard, he noticed the faint, glowing light spilling out from my bedroom window, and that soft light was illuminating something massive standing right next to the glass. As his eyes adjusted to the dark, he realized with absolute, paralyzing horror what he was looking at. It was a tall, incredibly large man. He was standing completely, totally motionless, just 2 inches outside my window screen, staring directly through the broken gaps in the blinds, watching me sit on my bed. My dad let out a furious, primal yell and sprinted across the wet grass toward him, but the man did not panic. He simply turned, ran 3 steps, and vaulted over the high concrete back fence effortlessly. My dad said he leaped over it with such practiced, fluid grace. It looked as if he had performed that exact escape route 100 times before. He disappeared into the neighboring yards within seconds.